level, but in a specific context and for a specific community. So we're trained to communicate in terms of scientific publications. We're trained to communicate in terms of how you write an effective grant. What we're not necessarily trained to communicate is how to get down to the bottom line up front. For instance, we're not trained to analyze complex issues and boil them down. We find generally science communication is really difficult for scientists who are experts, because when you simplify things, that's not quite accurate, and we get very attached to the details. And so we can't effectively communicate with society as a whole through scientific publications and that style of communication, but at the same time, there needs to be a high level of accuracy and fidelity reflected in popular science communication. And so there are science communication programs, and I'm not a professional science writer, but there are many who have specific ways of that they talk about and tools that they talk about using to communicate science. A lot of them involve things like narrative, so telling the story. And back again, thinking about your science as a story is something that very effective grant writers do, but not necessarily something that we're taught explicitly. And in fact, understanding narrative structure, literary skill, that's another example of how a humanities competence in science would facilitate that sort of cross-disciplinary function.
I'm not sure how many of you are aware that Alan Alda, this is a particular passion of Alan Alda's, and he is using theater improv techniques to help scientists learn how to communicate with a variety of audiences better at Stony Brook. There's a program at Stony Brook there, you might want to look into that. We saw a demonstration of this at the Council of Graduate Schools meeting a couple of years ago, and it was really quite remarkable, the change. He actually did a demonstration on stage, and the change in just a short period of time in how that communication took place after some involvement in some theater improv workshops.
I do think that communication is a big sort of gaping hole in graduate science education, and I personally think of it as a piece with the bioethics and policy, because you can't affect policy without being a good communicator. And the one thing that I most get on my science grad students about is it's not dumbing it down, it's translating it. They just don't speak your very specialized language. It's not that they're stupid. They just don't speak your language. So you have to translate into language that they can understand. And I always give them the homework assignment of, turning to their left at Thanksgiving and explaining what they do successfully. So I agree that it's a hole in the education system.
Let me add something to that. One of the things that I had the great pleasure and honor of doing over the past 4 years is working at a DC area think tank that interacted quite a bit with this organization as well as several others. And of course, the nature of an organization like AAAS and some of the things we had done at Potomac Institute were to reach out to broad publics, interdisciplinary publics. You get rather spoiled when you're an academician. You're dealing with graduate students, you're dealing with very sophisticated undergrads, and you sort of have them held captive, and you're giving them a grade. You don't grade the public, and very often it would be impossible to try to grade the media. So I think one of the things that comes out of that experience, at least for me very, very quickly, is that there's a particular way that one needs to engage the media in these days of open access journals and very, very rapid exchange via the internet, so as to be able to still be the responsible steward and shepherd of the nature of knowledge that is important to communicate. Now, how those skills are then facilitated then goes back to the fact that this needs to be then trained and inculcated in those programs that begin early on at the high school years and move themselves up through college. So in fact, it's just not taking the individual who's STEM educated and locking them away in a solipsistic silo, but essentially de-siling that to then be part of the more social and public milieu. That in many ways creates that sense of communicative responsibility for the scientist, but it also opens doors for the individuals who are working in the humanities to be able to then get engaged in the scientific exchange that certainly defines the nature of the society in the 21st century. So it's becoming more and more of an ideal. And I should let you know, It's really not new. The idea of that type of truly integrated humanistic, humanities, and scientific interdisciplinarity construct came out of the Humboldtian construct of education back in the 1800s. So perhaps what we're really seeing is that as we swing forward the pendulum of science and technology, we need to revisit certain things that grew out of our first push of science and technology back with the Industrial Revolution. Other question?
Hi, I'm Gladys White. I teach in the Liberal Studies program at Georgetown. I have a question for Carol Ertig as well as one for Rachel. My question for you, Carol, is the neuroscience underpinning for learning a second language fairly similar or dissimilar to the neuroscience underpinning for learning and completing sign language? In other words, is what happens in the brain when you acquire a second language very similar or dissimilar from what happens in the brain when you sign and learn to sign?
Well, I think what we're beginning, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I wish my colleague were here to flesh this out a bit, but what we're learning from our studies and previous studies that we're building upon is that learning a sign language and learning a spoken language is exactly the same. It's exactly the same process.
Thank you.
It's what happens in the brain. Now, this isn't first or second language, but these are, I'm talking about the two modalities. So the brain tissue is the same brain tissue is engaged, and it seems primed to accept the temporal patterns, and it doesn't matter whether it's coming from the hands or coming from the spoken input.
Thank you, very interesting. Exactly what I sort of wanted to get at. My second question is for Rachel. I was interested in your reference from the Nuffield Council, their recent report, which I was unaware of in the neuroscience area. I visited the Nuffield Council some years back and looked at their work related to assisted reproduction. I wondered, in this new area of neuroscience, did you feel that they were able to identify and marshal the scientific talent there to create a groundbreaking report on these topics? I know they've got the ethics expertise, but what about the neuroscience expertise?
So I'm not sure that I'm necessarily qualified to answer that directly, but the person who is Dr. Giordano, who participated with it as a consultant on it. They cover specific neurotechnologies. In fact, most of it, yes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think one of the things that this particular Nuffield Council report did a fine job of doing is pulsing the international neuroscientific community appropriately so as to be able to get something of a reasonably fine-grained view of what neuroscience techniques and technologies were available on the proximate horizon. What they really tried to do very much is parse out what would be something that would be far too distal or not yet, in fact, mathematically possible to do from some of these neuroscientific techniques, and that which may be conceptually possible and as a result represent a more viable intermediate probability. They've done a pretty good job with that. Some of the areas where the Nuffield Council report I think came up a little bit noticeably weak is that they really did not get an accurate representation of the real internationalization and global impact of neuroscience and technology, particularly as that feeds back into things like communication, education, public use, and even international relations and security and defense. But we need not hold that against the Nuffield Council report. I think it is very, very comprehensive. I think it's very granular and does a very good job in representing the neuroscience that was at hand as the report was being assimilated.
Thank you.
Sure. Other questions from the group? Please.
Just briefly, there's a lot of discussion about the importance of teaching neuroethics, and I believe it's well-founded. As someone who's dealt with the education system on lower levels, K through fifth at most, two concerns I've found that pop up are, one, when you're in the sciences, how do you grade and work with students who are very, very keyed into right and wrong answers on answering questions that are very subjective and difficult? And in that same vein, when you're dealing with answers or questions that don't have necessarily right and wrong answers, and you're teaching underpinnings, where religion as one of the foundations of ethics and a very difficult topic to discuss or address in the public school system especially, how does one fully or even helpfully address these issues when their hands are tied by numerous policy and other limitations?
I think a very important fact with the public schools would be to make sure the parents are involved early on in terms of what's going to be taught, what they might find offensive. But you're right, that's a major challenge because of the diverse society we have. Well, first of all, theists and atheists, starting at that level, and then within theism, all the different religions, traditions. I mean, it's hundreds of them. And some of these, like abortion, of course, euthanasia, these are all very extremely sensitive areas. But even in the private schools, even, let's say, Catholic schools, well, there's not just one Catholic point of view. There's a variety of points of views. So even within, I know some Catholic high schools that are teaching bioethics, but it's like really rigid, dogmatic, orthodox stuff that many other Catholics wouldn't want at all, So that it's like top down. This is what you have to believe. And it's almost all reproductive oriented, sex, basically. And there's a lot more to bioethics than that. And then there are others that are much more open and that they encourage. It's not so much the content, but how do you make a decision is, I think, more important than the decision you make. Because, we all make different decisions. And religion is only one part of our life. There's a lot of other aspects.
I have one question. It might totally change the topic, but it's still on education and ethics. So we spend a lot of time talking about teaching ethics, but what ethics should we be thinking about in using neurotechnologies in education, in teaching, in learning? It's kind of flipping the view of what we've been looking at.
Yeah, let me just get the ball rolling a little bit on that. One of the things that was brought up, at least somewhat tangentially in the Nuffield Council report, was the public or non-medical use of neuroscience and neurotechnology. It's also been some of the ongoing work of some folks locally, for example, Lane Kalbfleisch at George Mason University, my colleague Richard Cox, who's now at Duke University, certainly some of Michael Posner's work. We recognize that. The question then becomes, what do you do with neuroscience as an educational tool? What is education in the new century that will be dictated and defined by brain research? Can we, in fact, use brain research to then educate the mind? What does that mean? The question comes up often if, in fact, we're beginning to engage neuroscientifically oriented techniques. Is this a form of neurodoping? Is this actually some form of enhancement? And what do we do with that? And how do we parse out the haves and have-nots? All legitimate questions, by the way. But I think one of the things that's become very important is also to take a look at the educational system and ask quite simply, how has it changed? How is it not? How does it need to change given the new informational access that is available to students in real time in the reality of the circumstance of the educational milieu? The cognitive scientist Merlin Donald, for example, has looked at human cognitive evolution and purports, I think quite accurately, that the next step will be technologically defined and in many ways will be technologically enabled. So understanding that, I think, is not just a question of sort of armchair quarterbacking on Monday morning and go, well, children have this, that, and this and available to them, and it's going to change their brains and the way they learn in these particular ways. I think it's a question of harnessing that epistemological capital and using that epistemological capital in ways that are then going to shape education as the process it is, in fact, at least linguistically oriented to. Educare, to lead forth. How will we lead forth these students into what's going to be this next generation of a scientific and technologically enabled community? So I think it also becomes a huge responsibility to say, how do we translate that viably into techniques, not just technologies, but techniques that are valuable in the classroom? But as I certainly won't rob any of this fire at all, Mike Swetnam will come in this afternoon and he'll talk to you about going from neuroscience to neuroethics to policy and law. And policy is where the rubber hits the road. I'd like to be able to say that this is all very translatable, but you still have to remember that teachers' salaries are contingent upon this. And educating the teachers is very contingent upon this. Class size is contingent upon this. Access to these type of tools that are not necessarily high-tech are contingent upon this. We may have sufficient enough intellectual and I think academic money in the proverbial epistemological bank, but then how do we translate that into meaningful capital when that's the thing that's going to gain traction with our students? And I think that's as much a question as for policy as it is for educational protocol. So I'll now open the same question up to our group.
Well, first of all, I think that there is going to be a big difference between neurotechnologies going into the classroom and techniques based on neuroscience. I think even that is a really heavy lift. I mean, schools in Baltimore don't have soap in the bathrooms, so figuring out how to get the latest and greatest science into the classroom it's just a huge lift. So I'm going to put neurotechnologies aside, but I think it needs to start with teacher training programs, honestly, and having those be informed by the latest neuroscience, and potentially, continuing education credits on these topics, because even getting the techniques into the classrooms is going to be difficult. We have lots of teachers who've been teaching for 30 years and have never read a journal article. So just figuring out sort of the base level of getting research on education into the techniques that are used for teaching, I think, is our first and, frankly, a sufficiently large step to grapple with.
I don't have an answer to that specifically, but it is interesting, at least from the perspective of technologies that are used in education that might be able to access quirks of the nervous system or rules, neurological rules of learning. And also Jonathan Moreno's point this morning about the social networks and the connection between social networks and neural networks, possibly a preview for how those technologies might be used and what the consequences are might come, or we might be able to get an idea of that from looking at how social technologies are being used in education, and at least to the extent that we can compare what we understand and don't understand in social neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience, and bridging the two via that technology, that could be a route of investigation.
But let me pitch a curveball out here for just a second, and it's both one that I'll pitch to you with a bit of optimism and with a bit of pessimism that I hope that what you'll try to do is balance pragmatically. The optimism is such that I think one of the things that this may yield is new types or methodologies of learning. The idea that the more we understand the way the brain works, the more we may be able to tailor educational systems based upon the neuroscientific maxim, see one brain, see one brain. So it's not just a question of saying junior is 5 years old or 6 years old, but perhaps we may have particular levels and types of assessment that allow a much more personalized and individualized approach to the nature and style of education, tutelage, erudition that child may need. And as such, we may be adopting a posture similar to that which is being offered in personalized medicine, that then offers personalized education. Now, you're right. What do you do when you have a class full of 60 kids and they don't have soap? What does personalized education mean? Increasingly, what that may mean is that the venue for that education may not necessarily be held within the traditional silo of the schoolhouse. But this then also, I think, opens up the possibility of some rather dystopian, or at very, very least pessimistically worrisome offerings, trajectories. More and more, what we see is that many of these neuroscientific techniques and the actual techniques, the technologies that are available to implement them, are being rendered outside of the rather well-controlled clinical milieu that are now being offered direct to consumer. My colleague Nick Fitz up at the Neuroethics Core at the University of British Columbia has recently reported on do-it-yourself transcranial magnetic stimulation. And my colleague Don DeRousseau has recognized that much of neurofeedback, EEG-based neurofeedback, is available through games and learning programs through commercial entities that are direct to consumer without any of the necessary caveats in place to recognize you deal with some very, very powerful technologies. So the question then becomes, if we say that here's neuroscience and neurotechnology that may be able to facilitate education, but it's not being through policy and through funding incorporated into the educational system, then what we then tend to do is pitch this out to an at-home use, which then obviously falls victim to market value models, commoditization, and escalating commercialization. This can be worrisome. Because are we going to put on the label, caution, the Surgeon General has issued a warning that neurofeedback may be hazardous to juniors' health if and when they have A, B, and C condition. Mom, dad, you need to then go through the neurodiagnostics to do this. Or do we simply say more is better, like the little girl on the insurance commercial said, we want more, we want more. To what end? When does education become enhancement? How much is too much, and to what goals? This then once again speaks to policy and guidelines. And I think what it really does is reinstantiate the responsibility of education as a system to recognize the power of neuroscience as a tool. With that, what I'd like to do is I'd like to just go down the row very, very quickly and say, if you could, a magic wand, the genie in the bottle, if you could evoke change so that neuroethics education could in fact be meaningful, in one sentence, how would you make the change? Let's start with you, Deb.
I would say, well, can I be more broad and say bioethics?
No.
No, I have to stay within neuroscience?
Absolutely.
Okay. So within neuroscience programs across the U.S., I would hope that there would be funding to have bioethics integrated as a continuous thread throughout all courses and lab work.
Carol.
Establish more educational neuroscience programs.
Well done. Joe.
I would invite the 50 state superintendents of schools, have them sit in this auditorium, and have a dynamic set of speakers to sell them on it. Because, what's it, one sentence. Well, maybe it could be.
You can make it two, it's all good. There's semicolon, it's all right.
Because unfortunately, in the public schools, it's all top-down. If you can't convince the top people, the state boards of ed, it's not going to work its way up. So,
Rachel?
get a grant, bring them all in, wine and dine them, and let them hear the stuff. No, I think you could.
Use the issues that neuroscience naturally brings up, such as autonomy and agency and motor control, for instance. Use the connection between those themes as a means for bringing in neuroethical study with neuroscience advanced education.
And with that, I'd like to thank each and all of you for your time. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Have you spent time in London?
All right, just a housekeeping issue. For those of you who were here this morning, you know that as you leave the auditorium, you will be passed a slip of paper to tell you which breakout room to go to. Again, I hope you enjoyed the discussions. They were quite lively at lunchtime, and I think they will be again. Feel free to grab some cookies and drinks on your way there, and we will meet here again in 1 hour. Thank you.
Oh, here, I'm going to put these down there. Yeah, here you go. In case anybody wants.